Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this morning on recovery and financial sustainability. And thanks very much for joining us this morning. Firstly, to introduce myself, I'm Emer O'Riordan, and I'm an Audit and Advisory Partner here at Mazars, and I work mostly in the privately owned business sector, working with retail, distribution, hospitality, technology clients. And we're delighted to welcome you here to the webinar. So our presentation this morning looks, first of all, I suppose, at the economic environment for context. And then I'll take you through the framework that we're using to support our clients to plan for the future, taking care of the immediate and more critical and urgent issues up front, and then with a view to protecting the value of the business and their competitive edge into the recovery period. Okay, so firstly then, to look at the kind of broader and more global scale at forecast world GDP. So just on the next graph, we can see the sharp dip in performance that we've seen graphs like this, many of them unfortunately, and the sharp dip in performance, I suppose, isn't the only impact of the crisis. It's now, I suppose, a debate and becoming more clear the more prolonged period that we're going to be going through this crisis. With downward revisions in all G20 economies for 2020 and 2021. And I suppose from an Irish perspective, we're looking at least 8% decrease in GDP in 2020, and that ranges into even a larger potential decrease depending on how sharp that prolonged or how prolonged the recovery is. So there are supportive macroeconomic policies that will help to restore confidence and give a level of liquidity into the system, I suppose. But the impact means that many companies will have difficult decisions to make as to when or whether to operate and how to move forward. So there are some of the areas that we're going to look at. So looking at this timeline in Ireland, like it's kind of incredible to think back at now the 12 weeks or I suppose 13 weeks, how quickly this situation evolved from the first 2 weeks of the virus being detected. And from the introduction of, say, the temporary wage subsidy scheme, which was a very important initiative as part of those macroeconomic and government supports, with over 480,000 employees having support from the government under the scheme, and another nearly now 600,000 people signed on to the pandemic unemployment payment. So I suppose the introduction then of the 5 phases gives a bit more clarity to us in the roadmap, but I suppose there's constant threat or potential for the second wave that we're all very, I suppose, conscious of. So hopefully we're moving into phase 2 on Monday the 8th of June. And events have just moved so quickly, and I suppose I'd encourage everybody to keep almost like a diary, a timeline of events for your own business and what decisions have been made, and just document, you know, how different measures have been taken on in your own business. Because I suppose thinking back on the last 12 weeks, decisions were made so quickly and operational plans put together very quickly, just to keep a record of when all those decisions were made and measures were taken on. So just to, I suppose, what has this meant for consumers and consumer spending? As what we've intuitively known and have experienced, but in data published by the central bank, we can see here the effects of the crisis and the lockdown has had on consumer spend during that very acute period of March, where we see the collapse of ATM withdrawals and retail card spending. And I suppose this reflects a number of things: the cautiousness about spending money and an inability to do so, because people's incomes were impacted, and there was, not much clarity as to maybe there will be further impacts coming down the road. And per the ESRI, 38% of this household spend falls into the restricted category. So there was just an inability to be able to spend the money. So I suppose just looking at the particularly impacted sectors, and looking at a few of those sectors, I suppose first of all looking at retail and those consumer spend slides tell the story themselves. We've seen huge changes in consumer sentiment and what people buy and how they buy it, down to health and safety, maybe stress, escapism, the delivery coming to the door being actually the highlight of your day. So pluses and minuses, but retail has really been at the front line of this crisis. And many retailers have and continue to make very difficult decisions as to how and when to open up, and what that looks like from an operational and profitability perspective. retailers would depend very much on looking at margins, and margins are volatile, and assumptions such as staffing rates and things like that, they're constantly changing, so that your old assumptions that underpinned your basic budget and your basic financial monitoring positions are now constantly changing. Then looking as well at hospitality and tourism have clearly been devastated by the restriction on movement. And again, difficult decisions around viability, margin, reopening, and changing your business model to be able to accommodate, which we've seen mostly in the hospitality sector. With oil and gas, again, oversupply and increased production have reduced economic activity, leading to decreased demand. So that industry as well has seen dramatic cuts to costs and capital expenditure programs, and may continue to experience volatility like this for the next number of years. And just to bring in as well the technology sector, because there have been, positives and negatives, I think, for different aspects of the technology sector. Trends like accelerated digital transformation programs that businesses have undertaken because of necessity to either accommodate their operations, their workforce, or serving their customers in a different way. So some of those transformation programs have been rapidly accelerated, which means much more dependence and investment in those technologies. And I see things like collaborative software, AI, robotics, virtual reality, cloud computing, cyber security, lots of services around that are on the up. But then again, I suppose the IT capital project expenditure can also have been impacted, as businesses all look to pull back on expenditure when they were protecting their cash and their reserves to face into the crisis. So some of that business-to-business services, like any of business-to-business service industries, you have to look at not only your customer, but your customer's customer to really get a sense of the impact that that's going to have on your own business. So that's just some of the context. And I suppose just then moving into our preparation for this recovery period and the work that we've been doing with our clients. So I suppose the first thing is looking at what is the length of time that we're looking at here. And I suppose the answer is it depends, and it depends on the business and on the sector. But we've broken down the expected duration of the crisis down into what we see are three key economic phases, and they are the acute, the suppression, and the recovery phases. So with the acute phase being when the peak infection and mortality rates occur, economic lockdown is in place, and that lasts, say, 10 to 12 weeks. And that's the period that we're kind of moving out of now, as we're in our 5-stage approach in Ireland, moving into the next phase, which is the suppression phase. And the suppression phase is very much, what we're facing into now, lesser restrictions, but still social distancing. We're still living with the virus, and that this could last 9 to 12 months period, as we continue to find ways and new ways to work and evolve our economy around and our businesses around this phase. And then into recovery phase, which would be, looking at 1 or 2 years post. And this phase is really where the longer lasting effects of the economic slowdown and then that recovery back to almost like where we were when we started. And I suppose the key questions are what phases, how are these phases going to be for your business, and what are the different impacts on your business going to be throughout of these phases, and how can you best prepare for them to protect the business and the shareholder value that you've built up in this long-term value. So then just moving on to kind of the program itself. So Mazars has developed a unique program to support clients throughout this turbulence as a result of this crisis. And we're using this methodology across Mazars, across the world. It's a 6-phase approach which assesses the business financial performance to date, the impact of the crisis, what are the crisis management priorities and strategies, and then moving into the crisis action plan, financial modelling, and then execution and monitoring. So I suppose these are the 5 key pillars, and we're going to just look at each of those in detail. So looking at phase 1, this is the first port of call now to build a picture of your pre-crisis performance. And this is important for a number of reasons. Firstly, to demonstrate the viability of the business before the crisis. And that's important for third parties particularly. If we're looking at getting some funding, whether that be from credit lending, from say grants like Enterprise Ireland grants, or if you're looking for new investment. The viability of the business pre-crisis and the track record of that business is very important, and that's a necessary step to take. And I suppose it also gives us a baseline as to what we're building on and how we can assess the impact of the crisis and the mitigating actions that you're going to take to address the crisis. So that it gives you the baseline for that. So we assess the performance over a number of the key areas that you can see there on the slide, like revenue, the profile of the cost base, the cash flow, and the balance sheet strength. And I suppose the key questions at the end of this section, when we look at the pre-crisis track record, are: has the business sufficient cash to resources to survive in the short term, and is the balance sheet strong enough to absorb a poor year in terms of trading for 2020 as a first go? And does it make sense to proceed to the next step, which is looking at how you can mitigate the crisis? So unfortunately, like some businesses, having looked at this, they would have already had issues on viability, and looking into a depressed economy, no, can't go any further, and now is a position at a point where they might consider some more restructuring options, like Tom is going to discuss later on. So once we're happy to proceed then into the next phase, we move into the next phase, which is assess the impact of the crisis is likely to have on the business, and looking at the government and external supports that are available and can be taken advantage of. So in this phase, where we tease out the kind of impact in the crisis in a structured way, looking at the best, worst, and most probable case, so that we can get to a possible range and the sensitivity of the different metrics. So, for example, the impact of the crisis on top-line sales due to government restrictions and customer demand, etc. You know, your sales teams, they really have to understand, I think, you know, the potential, and they can foresee the impact on top-line sales coming forward, because they have been in constant contact with their clients from the perspective of trying to understand their needs, trying to understand their financial position, trying to understand your own exposure from a kind of a WIP or a kind of debtor ledger perspective. So sales teams have a very, very good sense of the, particularly into the next phase, as to what sort of the impact of this on the top line sales is going to be looking forward. And then looking across, I suppose, the acute suppression and the recovery phases. So we look at also the cost-based profile, whether that's, and trying to understand, are the expenses, whether they be administrative, etc., whether they are deferrable or cancelable, or you know, expendable, or are they essential costs, and really prioritizing the cost base. And then similarly looking through, so working through the asset base, working capital, cash and reserves. You know, what is the impact the current crisis is going to have on a best, worst and most probable case through the three phases that you've identified and that you've put timelines around. And then also the government support piece. What government support was the temporary wage subsidy scheme being one of the most prevalent at the moment. And that a lot of clients have been able to take up and make absolute use of, and what is the impact of that going to have on your cost base. So I suppose the purpose of this phase is to understand what impact is the crisis going to have on my business, without me actually, before I can look at what actions to take to address that. So once you've completed this analysis, you'll be able to address a few questions. You know, what's the expected timeline for the crisis for your business? How large is the profit gap that you have to address with mitigating actions? And like, is it feasible to develop suitable operational plans for the sales levels that you're likely to face into for the next period? You know, does it make sense to move into the next part of planning, or does it, should other alternative avenues be explored at this point, like restructuring? So at this point of the assessment, some of our clients that we've been working with, you know, they know that at this point there is no amount of sort of actions that are going to bridge this gap, that there's a very serious issue there, that the reserves aren't there to take it, and that restructuring options will be explored at this stage. And it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Like, it's not necessarily all of the business. You know, we've also had clients that at this point they can very quickly isolate, well, there's a, say if they had been branching into a new market, whether it be a geographic market or a product market, and that they are saying, well, that was struggling as it was, and that maybe we need to restructure that part of the business, and then just carry on and focus on protecting the core and the kind of shareholder value that's embedded in the core of the business. So it's not like I say, an all or nothing. It might become very clear at this point that some parts of a larger group, that some points should look at restructuring, or whether it be maybe foreign subsidiaries or something like that were struggling. Maybe they should be dealt with in a different manner, and then continue on with the main part of the business. So then, once we're happy to move on to the next phase, and the moving to the next phase is all about defining, and phase 3, it's about defining what are the top priorities of the shareholders, and what are those real guiding principles that you're going to underpin any of these decisions that you're going to make. That could be protecting the investment, protecting the future trade of the business, protecting employment, avoiding debt or further leveraging, and then we can start assessing the very high level options that are available to the business. You know, and from the information from phases 1, 2, and 3, we can then move into building a really detailed crisis action plan, then moving into phase 4. And this involves developing what we call breakthrough objectives. So these are objectives that are designed to mitigate the impact of the crisis and deliver on the priorities of the shareholders that we've identified and the ongoing needs of your customer base. So these breakthrough objectives are generally centered around, you know, top line sales, actions that can be taken around that, operations and supply chains, management support and overheads, government and external funding, working capital, and then crisis and agile management. So they're the sort of broad headings that they fall under. But it is what are these actions that we're going to take, and what are we going to, we need to, I suppose, achieve 3 things on these action plans. So when we move on to, and just on the next slide, you can see, we want to really quantify what is going to be the financial impact of each of these broad strategic breakthrough objectives. What is going to be the financial impact? And then develop detailed action plans as to how is it going to be executed and delivered. And then assigning milestones, owners, timelines, and putting very good and stringent project management principles in place around the execution of this plan. So some of the, if one of the large objectives is that we really need to address the decline in sales, looking at possibilities around new revenue streams, new sales channels, or, you know, there may be mothballing certain type of trading activities. So it's really to put those principles in place around that. What is the financial impact of this action going to be? What are the detailed actions that are going to deliver on this objective? And then to assign these timelines and milestones to each of these. Moving down then to operational costs, similarly looking at different aspects of your supply chain, of your overhead cost reductions, what can be done there, and what is the impact of that going to be on your financials. Looking at different finance options, whether for government or other external funding, grant funding, and then, like say, renegotiating loan terms. The different action plans that are put in place around working capital, particularly around stock and debtors. You know, there may be very specific actions that need to be taken to address those, finding other ways to liquidate stock, etc. And then crisis and agile management, looking at, like, a lot of businesses have had the opportunity and have seen the opportunity and really grasped it at changing their business model at this point in time, and being opportunistic and agile and fast. And I suppose that's one of the key messages from this, is that, you know, a lot of businesses have seen opportunities like that, and what actions would need to be taken, and what would the financial impact of those type of actions be on the business as you look out through this suppression and into the recovery phase. So I suppose at the end of this, you'll have a very kind of detailed action plan, and then to be able to step back and say, does this make business sense? You know, do we have the resources to implement this? And do we have the necessary project management disciplines in place? And does the strategy and the associated action plans have the potential to deliver on the strategic themes and the priorities that have been identified by the shareholders in phase 3? So, so then I suppose moving on from this and into phase 5, which is into quantifying the impact of these breakthrough objectives and the actions that you're going to take, and building a revised financial model that's going to look out over 18, 24 months, maybe 3 years, depending on the, you know, depending on the timeline, the sector, and the actions that are being taken. And this is like an integrated P&L cash flow, P&L balance sheet and cash flow model. So the inputs from that are from phase 1 are pre-crisis baseline, looking at then what is the impact that the crisis is having on our business, what are the mitigating actions and the priorities that we're going to take, and those key strategic decisions. And then this financial model will help us to understand the business case of each of those breakthrough objectives, prioritizing those activities, and then setting expectations and budgets for the performance over the next 2 to 3 years. So I suppose the key questions that we can answer after doing the financial model and having this financial forecast is like, what are the key areas of risk that accompany these as well? I suppose risk management is something that travels alongside the financial plan. There may be areas that, you know, might have been impacted by the crisis, but mightn't show themselves in your profit and loss account, particularly at the moment, or cost-cutting measures may have an impact on that risk management part of it as well. So that has to be considered as alongside the financial model. What are the KPIs really of this financial plan as we move forward? You know, have you identified all of the cost reduction, the working capital, funding measures, etc.? And does this financial revised forecast, does it make sense? And then this is, I suppose, that opportunity to step back and say, does this make business sense? And then I suppose moving into phase 6, which is monitoring and the constant reevaluation. More than ever, as you can see by the number of changes and measures that have been taken over the last, over the last number of weeks, we can really see that this plan has to stay alive, and using those KPIs to monitor, you know, at this unprecedented rate of change to strategy and operations, and being able to, on a monthly basis, compare the plan to the actual and the responses, and just with the ever-changing environment, do your assumptions still make sense? And to have that flexibility, that ability to be able to flex up and down, and that the business plan very much stays alive. I suppose monitoring the timing as timings change. You know, you can see so many, say, you know, retailers or people, you know, as the phases move, that they've had to move with them, and the different operational challenges that has presented to them. So, you know, this plan has to stay very much alive. You know, does the business need more cost-cutting measures? Is working capital at the right levels? You know, do we need more funding? And what are the changes to the environment that are going to impact on our plan? So thank you very much for attending, and I hope that you got a lot from it. And please follow up with us if you have any questions arising from the content of the webinar.